Martin Wolf, your sense of what Beijing is picking up from the war in Ukraine, and does it increase Xi Jinping's chances of getting more aggressive with Taiwan? We've got, why I ask this question is also because we've got the People's Liberation Army amassed in our perspective in a completely irrational, illogical fashion against India and refusing to go back.
Well, again, I try not to get involved in discussions on subjects which I don't regard myself as having any expertise upon. I think Ian's analysis is completely convincing. So if they were even borderline sane, they will not invade Taiwan. And I would, if I were having to bet my life on it, I would take very, very long odds against that happening. But if I've learnt anything from my life history, I mean, I've made this point often enough. I was thinking about what Alexander was saying about Putin's motivations. My parents were both refugees from Hitler, who had very similar motivations. So one of the things I believe very, very determinedly is that, by and large, you can assume that from time to time, a psychopath will get into power and will do things that most people would regard as completely unreasonable, because that's the sort of people that tend to get into power. My guess, very strong guess, is that Xi Jinping is not one of them. And therefore I'm reasonably confident that he's not going to do something which would certainly damage China, I think, immensely, quite apart from its damage to the world. So I hope that Mr. Putin is, at least for my lifetime, a one-off in this regard. And I think we all have to pray that. The problem is, and we haven't discussed it, of course, he owns about 4,000 nuclear weapons, and nobody knows what he will do if it becomes obvious that he's going to be beaten. And I share completely the desire for Ukraine to win, absolutely, but the question is, how does Russia lose? I don't see that.
So then where do we go?
I'm happy to leave it to the immensely wise people who run our foreign affairs and our governments to handle this very major mess. But I do think, actually, this is one point I've had this discussion with Kishore, it is in China's interest to help the West in this case. It is in both to help end the war. And she is one of the very, very few people who has the position, the standing, the relationship with Putin to encourage, cajole, influence him in the direction of saying, this is enough. Let's get this over with. Because I do think otherwise I don't see how this is ending.
Kishore Mahbubani, the contra perspective on that is that it suits the Chinese people, Chinese civilization, for Russia to be weakened even further. As a state dependent on Beijing, the weaker Moscow gets, the better it is, and therefore, contrary to what Martin Wolf is suggesting, it actually suits Xi Jinping for this war to go on.
Well, I think the biggest mistake we can all make is to underestimate the Chinese mind. Because the one strategic advantage the Chinese have when they enter into discussions about geopolitics is they never look at this year and next year. They look at the next 10 years, the next 20 years. And they have a very clear idea of where they're heading 10 years, 20 years from now. And they are absolutely certain that they'll become the #1 economy in the world within 10 to 20 years. And they are absolutely certain that when they become the #1 economy in the world, there'll be a reshuffling of the world order. Because countries, in some ways, in a very natural way, fall into place. They acknowledge, okay, there's a new top dog in the room, and we have to work with
Very often it doesn't happen in a bloodless, peaceful fashion.
Yes, exactly. But that's exactly my point about not underestimating the Chinese mind. They also realize that the biggest mistake that China can make is to engage in a war in the next 10 to 20 years. Because they've learned from Sun Tzu, that's a couple of thousand years ago, that the best way to win a war is to not fight it. And that's why they would avoid the use of massive war. And frankly, the big lesson I'm sure they learned from Ukraine is that you can have all the tanks in the world, you can have all the aircraft in the world, you don't necessarily win a war. So at the end of the day, it's in China's interest to have as much stability and order as possible. So if they can find a way of, in some way, bringing about an end to the war, certainly they'll be inclined to do that. But at the same time, a weakened Russia is not in China's interest. Because frankly, if you want to be absolutely cynical, and frankly in geopolitics it's better to be cynical than to be naive and altruistic. If this war in Ukraine drags on for 10 years, and it completely preoccupies Europe and the United States, China will get a free decade, just as it got a free decade after the United States invaded Iraq. I can tell you, I was in the Security Council when the discussions came about whether or not to support the United States invasion of Iraq. In theory, China opposed it. In reality, China was so happy that the United States invaded Iraq. So when it comes to geopolitics, assume that you're dealing with a master chess player with a long-term horizon and that can move and adjust and adapt in a way that many in the country...
You share Kishore's point of view, Samir, because that almost makes it seem like the 10-feet soldiers, they play six-dimensional chess, and that there's no way India or anybody else can outmaneuver them.
No, I think,
but India can outmaneuver them.
I think it's based on a few assumptions, Rahul. First is that Martin's, I call it the Martin threshold. Is Xi Jinping a psychopath or not? I think that's the first test. And if he has similar nostalgic yearnings for the Middle Kingdom, Alex, as clearly someone else does, of Ruski meat, you know, the question is, will that in many ways override the rationality we are attributing to China as an actor? And some would suggest, sitting in this part of the world where we live, Rahul, that we are seeing a degree of irrational aggression from China in more than one space. And I do not want to give a certificate of sanity to Xi Jinping just yet. I think this is a space to watch out for, and it would be to our detriment if we were to give that certificate. We will have to contend with two realities vis-a-vis China. One, China, an economic actor that is going to be overwhelmingly numero uno in the next decade, in the coming decade, and that may be true. But we will also have to contend with our own response to that, which means building our economic resilience, but also building political muscularity to rebuff any adventurism that clearly we have begun to see emerge from Beijing in the last decade. And to pretend that the 2010s did not happen would be insanity. Now, I mean, you know, I want to just make one more point. And I think the Chinese lesson from Ukraine is yet to be learned. Let's not reach a conclusion that the Chinese believe that the 3 months have taught them a lesson. The Chinese play the long game, as Kishore mentioned. In 1 year time, the Chinese may have learned that this is all the response the Europeans could muster. And they may reach a very different conclusion. They may realize that it was all bluster. They are paying in rubles for energy. The political relationships with the rest of the world are fine. Everything has been normalized. Let's make a go for it. So I think the idea that the Chinese have taken any negative lesson as of now may not be valid.